Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're looking at the standoff, the spiraling standoff in Ukraine. Before we talk about sanctions and with our panel, let's say hello to James Creedon, he of Media Watch fame.
François.
James, we were talking at the outset about the shooting of the mayor of Kharkiv, a Russophone, who of late had been more pro-Kiev.
That's right, and the personality of Gennady Kernes is intriguing many on social media, François, and indeed what often happens in an event like this, people try to see what the online footprint of this person is, and he is a very prolific user of social media. So I'll just show you what the images that media websites, the websites and social media have been picking up on. This is one image of him with a tiger in his office. So he seems
stuffed tiger.
A stuffed tiger, indeed. He seems to be quite the character when it comes to putting his image out there on social media. He created an Instagram account in the summer of 2012, and even going back to March of last year, the Kiev Post was commenting on how he was cursing commentators on his Instagram account, posing sort of naked or half naked at least. The French weekend paper, the Journal du Dimanche, even went to interview him and put together this series of images also based on his Instagram account and his Twitter account. So certainly you're getting the sense of a person with quite a character. He's been accused in the past of having links to mafia organizations, and he does have convictions for fraud and theft. So an awful lot of curiosity about him, and this photo was put on his Instagram account just I think in the hours before he was indeed kidnapped, and of course he is very unwell, so that must be mentioned. But a great degree of curiosity about Gennady Kernes. Just one further angle as we're talking about media related stories in Ukraine, François, and that is in Donetsk in the southeast. The broadcasting center in the city saw the Ukrainian television channels based out of Kiev switched off and replaced with Russia 24. So clearly an ongoing attempt to dictate the narrative in Ukraine, and a media war very much underway, François.
All right, many thanks. James Creedon with our Media Watch segment. That media war, obviously part of the picture. I want to say hello once again to our panel, and joining us from Donetsk is France 24's Douglas Herbert, who is with us. Also joining us, France's former ambassador to Ukraine, Philippe de SUREMAIN, Dmitry SUSLOV of the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy joins us from Moscow. Apologies, Dmitry, for the technical issues we had in part one of our discussion. WASYLINA of the Observatory of the Black Gulf and Mediterranean Seas is back with us, and so is Boris, who teaches economics at the University of Paris-Est, former advisor to the Ukrainian government. Boris, who at the tail end of our discussion in part one talked about OSCE observers. They've been held since last Friday, saying it's a crime. I want to get your reaction to this. Dmitry SUSLOV, the OSCE observers.
I think that taking hostages is really a war crime, and I think that this episode proves that those people in Donetsk and Lugansk regions that are described as separatists, the pro-federalization activists, are not really 100% controlled by Moscow. Russia officially condemned those taking hostages and urged the leaders of that movement to change their course and immediately release them. I think it is very clear.
The Russian, we also heard this Monday, the Russian ambassador to the OSCE call it irresponsible of the OSCE to send monitors to that area.
Well, yes, because there is a counterterrorism operation going on there, conducted by the new Kiev authorities, which Russia regards as the war against its own people. The reason why Moscow stated that is that this sending of mission was not coordinated by the forces that control the territory in the two Ukrainian regions, namely in Donetsk and Lugansk regions. This is the only reason. I think if this mission would have been coordinated by them, then of course we wouldn't have seen any hostages. I think this is the reason why the Russian representative made this statement.
Ellen WASYLINA?
Coordinated by them. It's an international organization, and it's interesting that an international organization could not be able to travel and observe as it is its habit to see what's going on in this region. We're seeing a new move towards a change in international order, and the liberty or the actions of international organizations are coming under fire. What is their legitimacy in these areas, and can they move freely as they have been, or are we looking at two phenomenon, meaning that is the sovereignty of a country being respected, and are its leaders being respected for the responsibilities that they have as governors of a territorial state or an État-nation, we say in French, a state-nation? Or are we now seeing a move of, as we've seen, sort of a popular movement throughout Europe, and not only in Europe, a rise in nationalism with globalization flattening out, so to speak, identities, and a rise in more regional identities. We even see it here in France. We have the bonnet rouge, for example, in Bretagne, and different ideas and identities that come out when this globalization hits. So is it more of a crisis of identity? We're seeing several different things and issues that line up in this crisis in Ukraine. It's very interesting to see in terms, too, of geography, in terms of economic and political freedoms and activities in the region, and, of course, these, shall we say, these barriers almost that have been lifted or dropped that have allowed or permitted circulation of different groups, for example, as we see that are that can easily come in and infiltrate, for example, Ukraine.
So you agree with Dmitry SUSLOV that it's not just the hand of Moscow, as some might say?
I don't have all the information, François. I have quite a bit of information. What we've noticed in this part of Ukraine is that we've seen people with masks and unidentified uniforms, in other words, no insignias. However, what we have noticed are very well-equipped, very well-organized formations in a military sense. This has been noticed by many different observers to say that there is an organized, very well-organized attempt at destabilizing this particular region, and that the OSCE now cannot come back in, for example, and observe, and maybe they wanted to make sure that everything was going right, human rights violation we could talk about in particular. And with assassinations now, of course, this is, as we saw in Tunisia, we see now political assassinations, something to be called our attention to.
Douglas Herbert, in Donetsk, again, what's the feeling there as terms of how much of this is homespun and how much of this is coming from abroad?
Well, first of all, I just want to make one point about here in Donetsk. We are talking about the escalating tensions, these clashes tonight after this pro-Ukraine rally, pro-Russian separatists, running rampant, rampaging around, violent actions, buildings occupied. The media images, it is dramatic when you see it. And I'm not going to say that it isn't. But this is a town of 1 million people. And what has also struck me in the past week of reporting from here is the fact that most of the people in this town are very much going about their daily lives. And like I said earlier, the people that we tend to speak to are the people who turn out at these rallies, the most visible, the most vocal people, the ones who most want to be heard. But there is an entire part of this population that is if not, they're not separatists, they're not gung-ho pro-Russian, they're not gung-ho pro-Putin. They simply want to have their grievances better addressed. They think that this region has been ignored. They're much more mad at the conditions under which they've had to live, the corruption in the country, the collapse of the economy. They want to be able to work. They want to be able to live normal lives. This is not a town. This is not necessarily a region that is chock full of radicals and extremist separatists everywhere you look, even though that is the impression you can get. And there have been polls done in the past few weeks, including an interesting one by the Gallup, under the auspices of the Gallup organization, showing that about 2/3 or even more of the people in this region don't want to see a military Russian intervention, which is a whole nother issue, but that a vast majority do not want to secede from Ukraine, and they're not necessarily sympathetic to what these armed men I was talking about earlier are doing when they seize these buildings. But a lot of them are either afraid or very reluctant to go out and express those views openly, because they would be very much dissenting views if they were to show up at these rallies, at these checkpoints that are still manned by pro-Russian separatists. They tend to be keeping a lower profile. But if you get them on the side and you speak to them and you say, what do you really feel? They'll tell you that they don't always sympathize with a lot of the more virulent separatists that are the ones that we all talk about, because they are making the most dramatic images and the most dramatic media headlines.
Philippe de Surmain, Brussels and Washington, they see the hand of Moscow in all of this. In fact, this Monday they've tightened sanctions further. They've gone to include, most notably, the head of Rosneft, who's reportedly close to President Putin, but left out the likes of the boss of Gazprom. What do you think about this staggered approach and these tightened sanctions?
It's difficult to remain without reactions after what happened. And the issue is the next presidential election, will they take place or not? So after what happened in Crimea, it was impossible to remain without saying anything. The problem is to know how they can be efficient. So I know that there is big discussion saying that in many cases against other countries it was without any effects, but sometimes it can be effective, and I think in this case it certainly could have a real repercussion on a country which is not on a very stable economical situation. So
which country are you talking about? Ukraine?
Russia.
Russia
too. Ukraine, of course. Ukraine is in a very, very difficult situation, even if it's potentially a very rich country. But the next month or maybe the next year is really a problem. But Russia, who has enormous resources, is not in so good economical situation.
Dmitry SUSLOV, will these sanctions bite?
Well, I don't think so. Moreover, I think the sanctions that we are seeing now on the part of the United States, and probably, of course, to be continued by the European Union, show us that we've really reached the top, the bottom of sanctions. If Russia does not cross the Rubicon and interfere into the eastern Ukraine militarily without ground, without reasonable preconditions to do so. There is clear lack of support of the sanctions on the part of the European Union. European countries are not interested in imposing real economic sanctions which are designed to limit trade and investment. And this is why, of course, it is very unfavorable for the United States to go unilaterally, because it will show that the US is alone and, in fact, isolating itself in this situation, not isolating Russia. This is why we've seen some compromised, intermediary sanctions on the part of the United States, focusing again on visa limitations and sanctions against specific Russian companies, and only mildly touching upon real economic activity. They limited some part of defense trade, but not more. And I don't think that there will be the change of this pattern on the part of the European Union. So in fact, I don't think that those sanctions will ultimately change the Russian behavior.
All right, so you're saying that they won't bite at all. Speaking on the sidelines of his tour of the Far East, Barack Obama announcing that those sanctions were in the pipeline, and he explained what they were all about.
The goal here is not to go after Mr. Putin personally. The goal is to change his calculus with respect to how the current actions that he's engaging in Ukraine could have an adverse impact on the Russian economy over the long haul, and to encourage him to actually walk the walk and not just talk the talk when it comes to diplomatically resolving the crisis in Ukraine.
Boris NAJMAN, Republicans in Washington saying that the sanctions don't go far enough.
Yeah, I think we can agree on that the sanctions are very light. Also,
You think there should be tighter sanctions?
Yeah, I think so, because what I think, and a lot of analysts can also agree, is that Russia is kind of blackmailing and threatening at the moment Europe with different ways. And the reason why Europe is not answering is because the threats are at the moment very tough from Moscow, and this is the situation. So Europe thought that they can find a way, to find diplomatic ways with the Kremlin, but at the moment there is no channel for the discussion, and every channel have been closed on the Russian side. So it's a difficult situation, because you feel that the threat is very big on the Russian side. The troops are on the borders. There is missiles in Kaliningrad. There is the Cyprus problem with the banks. There is several issues with Syria. So it's not only about Ukraine. The situation is global at the moment. And Russia is not willing to negotiate at the moment. Why? The reason is that they think they have the strength with them, and they think we're weak.
So what are tougher sanctions then? What would be tougher?
The tougher sanctions means that you really block the transaction and the SWIFT, the SWIFT transaction that we use sometimes, sending banks, sending money, and you block the SWIFT and you isolate Russia from transactions. And this is the sanction that have to be. This sanction has to be implemented, to my point of view, as soon as possible, because this is a clear signal that Russia has not to go more enter in Ukraine.
And then WASYLINA?
Well, sanctions, we've seen what sanctions can do. They're a powerful tool. And I quote HERBERT Van Rompuy. He says, sanctions are not a question of retaliation. They are a foreign policy tool, not a goal in themselves, but a means to an end. And I go on, and he says, our goal is not to stop Russian actions, against Ukraine, and to restore Ukraine's sovereignty. We've seen sanctions being used on different countries, and what have these countries become? You have to remember, too, that the EU is the most important investor in Russia, and 75% of its foreign direct investments in Russia come from the EU member states. I don't have to tell you about the energy dependency that Europe has on Russia. Okay, so it's easy for the United States to say, which is 1% of their trade balance with Russia. The EU, however, is very much dependent, 100% in the Baltic states, 25% overall. It's easy for the US to say, let's do the sanctions, let's get tough sanctions, whereas who's going to bite the bullet here? It's the Europeans. Sanctions will only isolate Russia further. I believe we should open dialogue. We should open diplomatic channels. In fact, the Russian Ambassador Orlov was here in Paris at the France-Russia seminar on last Thursday. He said that there has been a mix-up of roles in the economic and commercial sides, and that the diplomatic channels, like you rightly say, are not open. I feel that sanctions will only isolate further the regime, that will even push Russia more up against the wall and will create a more defensive action. Whereas if there are opportunities for dialogue and discussion, like we saw in Geneva, in other words, that Russia, the US...
So you don't take Boris's point that it's strength, a show of strength that will bring Vladimir Putin to the bargaining table?
Well, I think sanctions may have worked in an isolated, old-style economy, maybe in a Cold War economy. We live in a globalized economy, as one of you brought up rightly just a little while ago. These, as you probably know, the Russians hold 9% of UK's GDP, okay? 9%. There are investments all over the world. So saying that we're going to, cut, okay, fine, let's cut the bank accounts, but you know how this works. There's Cyprus, there's offshore accounts, there's other ways of putting money in different, as you know. And so it's easy to say, okay, let's isolate Russia. To what point can we isolate Russia, especially Russia, who is the main, and I say main energy provider for Europe? Without energy, we have no prosperity, we have no more peace.
All right, a lot of reactions coming in from viewers, including one on Twitter from Rundfunk, who says, leaders think sanctions scare Putin, but they don't. Philippe de SUREMAIN, do you agree with that?
Difficult to answer, but first of all, we are always speaking about Russia. But Russia is not a simple country. It's a very complex one. And I think it would be better to speak about the Kremlin. And it would be interesting to see around Putin who is behind him, who is pushing in this way, and maybe there are others who are not on the same opinion. And there is also in Russia a civil society which is developing very fast. So I think it will be a dangerous simplification to see this confrontation as the war between two worlds. The great problem for the Kremlin is that there was the Orange Revolution, which was a shock for Moscow. Afterwards, there was this new revolution. The fall of Yanukovych, who was supported by the Kremlin, even if their relation were not so clear. But the challenge is the nature of the future regime in Ukraine, in a country who has many links with Russia. So I think if the presidential election take place, then it will be easier to analyze the situation afterwards. But this is the next step. And on the highest level in Moscow, it was said that these elections are illegal. And if they take place, the result will not be recognized. So how to do? Because the future is to know who will
Dmitry SUSLOV, can there be a deal whereby you have your election on May the 25th and a more federal Ukraine as spelled out in those recent Geneva discussions?
Well, this kind of narrative, I think, will not be obviously supported by Moscow because the elections of May 25 are designed to institutionalize and legalize the results of the illegal coup d'etat of February 22. In Russian perspective, it should be vice versa. First, there should be the constitutional reform, and second, there should be elections on the basis of the new constitution, the elections of the new president, new Rada, maybe creation of another, of the upper chamber of Ukrainian parliament, maybe establishment of the Ukrainian post of vice president who would represent another part of the country, and so on and so forth. I think the Geneva memorandum was a huge success in terms of spelling out the principles of resolution of the Ukrainian turmoil, which is constitutional reform, de-escalation, elimination, dissolving of the illegal military activists and groups, and so on and so forth. But now we need to agree on the schedule. Now we need to agree on the causality and development of the events. And it will be fundamentally wrong to start from presidential elections and continue with the reform after. I think if Ukrainian government will follow that path, they will ultimately result in a bloody civil war. And I don't think that it is in the interests of the European Union to see such a development. So I think there is a path for de-escalation, but in order to de-escalate, we need to come back to Geneva and to agree on the schedule, on the timetable of the events in Ukraine.
All right, so the argument there for a constitutional reform first, elections later, from Dmitry SUSLOV in Moscow. I want to thank you for joining us. I also want to thank the rest of our panel, Ellen WASYLINA, Philippe de SUREMAIN, Boris NAJMAN. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.